There is a face chiseled into the stone walls of Deir el-Bahari, or rather there was, because someone came with hammers and chisels and they worked methodically, room by room, corridor by corridor, and they carved her out of existence. They smashed her statues. They filled in her cartouches. They scratched her name from temple walls across the length of Egypt. Thousands of images, thousands of inscriptions, gone. But here is the thing about erasing someone. You have to know they existed to erase them. And that effort, that obsessive, decades-long campaign to unmake a person, is itself a kind of monument. Her name was Hatshepsut, and for 20 years she ruled the most powerful civilization on Earth. She was born around 1507 BCE, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, a warrior king who had expanded Egypt's borders from Nubia to the Euphrates. Hatshepsut grew up in the royal court, sharp-eyed and educated, watching how power moved. She was given the title of God's wife of Amun, the highest religious role a woman could hold. She understood ceremony and ritual and the theology of kingship from the inside out. When her father died, she married her half-brother, Thutmose II, as was customary. She became his great royal wife, the chief queen. And when Thutmose II died young, leaving behind only a 2-year-old son by a lesser wife, Hatshepsut stepped in as regent. This was not unusual. Queens had served as regents before, holding the throne steady until a male heir came of age. The assumption was always that she would step aside. She did not step aside. Within a few years, perhaps 2, perhaps 7, the exact timeline is still debated, Hatshepsut did something almost incomprehensible. She declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, pharaoh. She took the full titulary of a king. She wore the double crown. She carried the crook and flail. She strapped on the ceremonial beard. And Egypt, largely, went along with it. How? How does a woman in the ancient world, in a system built entirely around male divine kingship, simply become the king? She was brilliant. She was politically ruthless. And she understood something fundamental about power. It is not just military force. It is legitimacy. And legitimacy in ancient Egypt was theological. So she built her legitimacy in stone. At her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, she commissioned a series of reliefs that told a story, the story of her divine birth. In the carvings, the god Amun himself descends from the heavens, disguised as Thutmose I, and visits her mother Amos. From this union, Hatshepsut is conceived, not as a human child, but as the daughter of a god. The reliefs show Khnum, the divine potter, shaping her body and her soul on his wheel. They show the gods presenting her as the future ruler of Egypt. She was not just claiming power, she was retroactively rewriting the cosmology of her own existence. She also cultivated the priesthood of Amun with extraordinary care, enriching their temples, expanding their influence, making them stakeholders in her reign. In a theocracy, the priesthood's blessing is everything. She had it. And she had Senenmut. Senenmut is one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in Egyptian history. He rose from relative obscurity to become Hatshepsut's most trusted official, her chief steward, the overseer of her building projects, the tutor of her daughter Neferu. He held over 80 titles simultaneously. He was, by any measure, the second most powerful person in Egypt. There is graffiti carved into rocks near Deir el-Bahari, crude, satirical images that shows Senenmut in a compromising position with a figure wearing a royal crown. Ancient gossip, ancient scandal. We do not know the truth of their relationship. What we know is that Hatshepsut trusted him absolutely, and that he served her with a dedication that was, by the standards of any era, remarkable. He was also an architectural genius, or at least a genius at commissioning architecture. Deir el-Bahari, the mortuary temple he designed for her, is considered one of the most beautiful buildings of the ancient world. 3 colonnaded terraces rising against the face of a cliff, elegant and severe, harmonizing with the natural landscape in a way that still takes your breath away 35 centuries later. Hatshepsut did not just build, she traded.
In roughly the 9th year of her reign, she sent a trading expedition to the land of Punt, a place somewhere along the Horn of Africa, probably modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, a region Egypt had not reached in generations. The expedition returned with living myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. She had the entire journey recorded in vivid relief at Deir el-Bahari, the ships, the strange fish in the Red Sea waters beneath them, the round houses of the Puntites on stilts, the obese queen of Punt who has fascinated Egyptologists for a century. It was a diplomatic and economic triumph, and she made sure everyone knew it. She also conducted military campaigns into Nubia, into the Levant. She was not a warlike pharaoh. Trade and building were her legacy, but she was not passive either. She held Egypt's borders and kept its enemies in check. For 20 years, Egypt was stable, prosperous, and monumental. Obelisks rose at Karnak, the tallest Egypt had ever seen. Temples were restored and expanded. The economy flourished. By any objective measure, her reign was a success. And then she died, around 1458 BCE. Her cause of death, unknown. Thutmose III had been waiting his whole life. He had nominally been co-pharaoh with Hatshepsut since the beginning, that 2-year-old child who should have been king. He was not idle during her reign. He served in the military, rose through its ranks, became its commander. He was formidable in his own right, but she had overshadowed him absolutely. Now she was gone, and he was pharaoh, a role he would hold for another 32 years, and hold brilliantly. He became one of Egypt's greatest military commanders, pushing the empire to its greatest territorial extent. History has called him the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. But somewhere in the middle of his reign, not immediately, perhaps 20 years after her death, he ordered the erasure.
Why? This is the question that has consumed Egyptologists for decades, and the answer is almost certainly not simple hatred or wounded pride, though those may have played a role. The erasure was too methodical, too thorough, too strategic for pure emotion. The most compelling theory is succession. Thutmose III had a son, Amenhotep II, and he needed that son's claim to the throne to be unambiguous. Hatshepsut's existence complicated the lineage. She had been pharaoh. She had a daughter. If her memory remained vivid, it created the theoretical possibility of other claims, other challengers. Erasing her simplified the succession. There is also the theological dimension. Hatshepsut had grounded her rule in divine legitimacy. If you erase her from the records, her divine birth never happened. Her legitimacy dissolves retroactively, and the break in male succession that her reign represented simply ceases to have occurred. It was not just political murder, it was ontological murder, an attempt to unmake not just a reign, but a reality. The workers came to Karnak first, perhaps, to the red chapel she had built, to the obelisks she had raised. They plastered over her inscriptions. Where her image appeared alongside Thutmose III, they carefully chiseled away her figure and left his. In some places, they replaced her image with that of Thutmose I or Thutmose II, filling the narrative gap with acceptable male predecessors. The work was careful, professional, comprehensive, not the work of angry mobs, but of organized craftsmen following orders. At Deir el-Bahari, they went through room by room, every image of the pharaoh defaced, every cartouche gouged out, the beautiful reliefs of her divine birth, her trading expedition to Punt, her coronation, still there in their lines and colors, but with the protagonist surgically removed. Her statues, hundreds of them, were smashed and buried in a pit outside the temple, not randomly destroyed, but deliberately concealed, as if throwing them away entirely would itself be a kind of acknowledgement. And then, largely, it worked. For 3,000 years, no one knew she had existed. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut is one of the great detective stories of Egyptology. 19th century scholars studying the temples at Karnak and Deir el-Bahari kept encountering anomalies, inscriptions that used feminine grammatical forms alongside masculine royal titles, images of a pharaoh with an oddly delicate form, references to a ruler whose name appeared nowhere in the established king lists. In 1822, Jean-Francois Champollion, the man who cracked the Rosetta Stone, visited Deir el-Bahari and noted the feminine forms with puzzlement. Scholars debated. Some proposed a transvestite king.
Some proposed scribal error. It was the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted in the early 20th century who began to piece together the full picture. And it was Herbert Winlock, excavating the pit of smashed statues outside Deir el-Bahari in 1927, who found the physical evidence, hundreds of fragments of a woman who had been systematically destroyed. The fragments went into storage at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where they would sit for decades. In 2005, Egyptologist Zahi Hawass identified a mummy that had been in the Cairo Museum since 1903, catalogued, forgotten, unexamined. Dental analysis, CT scans, a DNA comparison with a lock of hair found in a box bearing Hatshepsut's name. The mummy was obese, middle-aged, and had died with a tooth abscess that may have become infected. She had bone cancer. That mummy was almost certainly Hatshepsut. She had survived anonymously in the very museum dedicated to Egypt antiquity, hidden in plain sight, just as her story had been hidden in plain sight across the walls of temples that bore her work, but not her name. There is something important to sit with here. Thutmose III was not a villain. By the standards of his time, he was an exceptional ruler. The erasure of Hatshepsut was a political act, not a moral one in any modern sense. It operated within a system of logic that was entirely coherent to its practitioners. Kings erased predecessors. History was not a neutral record, but an ideological tool. And yet, what he did required sustained, organized effort. It required him to look at 20 years of prosperity, of building, of trade, of stable governance, and decide that it needed to be unmade. It required him to look at a face carved in stone and decide that face should not exist. The fact that it didn't fully work, that the erasure was incomplete, that the feminine grammar survived in the cracks, that the statues were buried rather than ground to dust, suggests something. Perhaps reluctance, perhaps practical limits, perhaps the simple truth that you cannot completely destroy what has been built into the bones of a civilization. Hatshepsut raised obelisks that still stand. She built a temple that still draws thousands of visitors every year. She sent ships to Punt and brought back living trees. She was erased for 3,000 years, and she came back anyway. That is the story, not just of a woman who ruled Egypt, but of what happens when power tries to unmake itself and fails. Because here we are, talking about her, and no one remembers the name of the man who ordered the hammers.